Black elderly woman humiliated at the bank. Luckily, Vin Diesel was there. Some stories start in the most unassuming places on an ordinary day, only to uncover profound truths about human nature. That's exactly what unfolded one late afternoon at the First Pacific Bank on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. The bank was a mess. Long lines snaked from the counters to the entrance, customers shifting restlessly, checking their watches, and muttering their frustrations. The air was thick with impatience as employees hurried between tasks, struggling to manage the overwhelming rush. Behind the counter, Brittany Wallace, a young teller with weary eyes and an obvious lack of enthusiasm, tapped away at her keyboard. She had worked here long enough to know which customers were worth her time, and she had already decided that the older woman in front of her wasn't one of them. Linda Carter, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher, stood quietly, her fingers gripping an envelope, hands slightly unsteady. She had always prided herself on her independence, never one to seek favors or charity. But today, she needed clarity. Lately, she had noticed strange deductions in her account, small fees, but significant enough to affect her already stretched pension. Every dollar mattered. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "I believe there's been a mistake in my account. I've been charged fees I was never informed about." Brittany barely lifted her gaze, fingers still clacking on the keyboard. "Those are standard account maintenance fees, ma'am," Brittany said in a monotone, barely masking her impatience. Linda hesitated, holding out her receipt. "But I've had this account for years, and I've never been charged these fees before." Brittany let out a dramatic sigh, finally glancing up with clear irritation. Snatching the envelope from Linda's hands, she flipped through the papers lazily before shoving them back toward her. "It's in the fine print of your agreement. If you didn't read it, that's not our problem." Linda blinked, caught off guard. A few people in line chuckled as Brittany rolled her eyes, making sure it was loud enough to be noticed. Heat crept up Linda's face. "Look," Brittany continued with an exaggerated smirk, "if you don't want fees, you need to keep more money in your account. That's how banks work, ma'am." The humiliation had begun. Linda's throat tightened. She wasn't here to argue. She just wanted fairness. She had been a loyal customer for decades. But as she scanned the room, she realized no one was willing to meet her eyes. The same strangers who had grumbled about their own long wait times now suddenly acted as if they hadn't seen a thing. Linda's voice softened, but she refused to let go of hope. "I just want to understand what happened." At that moment, Carl Jensen, the branch manager, strode over. He had been watching from a distance, arms crossed, as if weighing whether this was worth his time. Carl was a man who measured everything in dollars and minutes, and in his mind, Linda Carter wasn't worth much of either. Clearing his throat, he looked down at her with a thin, calculated smile. "Is there a problem here?" His tone made it clear he wasn't expecting an answer. Brittany immediately straightened, snapping to attention. "No, sir," she said quickly, as if speaking to a superior officer. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies." Carl turned his gaze to Linda, his polite smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Ma'am, we have standard fees in place. If you can't maintain the minimum balance, there's nothing we can do." Linda squared her shoulders, summoning every ounce of dignity she had left. "I've always kept my account in good standing," she said firmly. "These fees just started appearing. I'm only asking for someone to review them." Carl let out a short, amused chuckle. "What's in the system is in the system, ma'am. We don't review automated charges." Then came the final blow. Carl leaned slightly over the counter, and in a voice loud enough for the entire bank to hear, said, "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this bank isn't the right place for you." A sharp silence gripped the room. Linda swallowed the lump in her throat, fingers tightening around the envelope. She had never felt so small. Then a deep, steady voice sliced through the air. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The entire bank froze. Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap stood there, his stance firm. At first glance, he looked like any other customer, casual, unassuming. But something about him was different. His posture, his tone, his very presence commanded attention. Carl turned slowly, annoyance flickering across his face. "And who are you to question how we handle our customers?" The man stepped forward, removing his cap. The gasps were immediate. Vin Diesel. Yes, that Vin Diesel. The Fast and Furious icon. The action legend. A man who had played some of the toughest, most fearless characters on screen. And now, he stood in the middle of the bank, eyes locked onto Carl Jensen. Carl's confidence wavered. "Mr. Diesel, I—" Vin lifted a hand slightly, silencing him. His voice was calm, yet firm. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is why you're treating this woman like this." Linda turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. Carl cleared his throat, struggling to regain control. "Sir, this is none of your concern. We have policies, and this lady doesn't meet the requirements." Vin tilted his head, unreadable. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he asked, "Policies? Or just an excuse to humiliate someone who's simply asking for fairness?" A few customers murmured in agreement. Brittany, who had been so self-assured moments ago, now glanced nervously at Carl, waiting for him to fix the situation. Vin turned back to Linda, his voice now softer. "Ma'am, what exactly is the issue? Can you show me what's going on?" Linda hesitated before handing him the envelope. Vin took it carefully, scanning the documents inside. A few moments passed. Then he looked up at Carl, his expression unwavering. "This is a mistake," Vin stated plainly. "These charges shouldn't be here. You're going to fix this." Carl opened his mouth, but Vin raised his hand again, cutting him off. "If it's an error, you'll correct it," Vin continued, his voice unwavering. Then his tone dropped, calm, controlled, but carrying undeniable weight. "And if it's not? A much bigger problem for you." Carl's face paled. Brittany fidgeted, her earlier confidence evaporating. The tension in the room was thick enough to slice through. Carl shifted his weight, darting a glance at Brittany, as if silently pleading for an escape. But she had none to offer. Vin stood his ground, arms crossed, unwavering. For the first time that day, Carl Jensen looked genuinely uneasy. The seasoned bank manager had spent years perfecting the art of brushing off customers like Linda Carter, people he deemed too old or too insignificant to matter. But never had he imagined being confronted like this, let alone by Vin Diesel. Now, every eye in the bank was locked onto him. The same customers who had dismissed Linda's struggle now watched with rapt attention, their gazes shifting between the Hollywood star and the man in the stiff suit. Vin's voice remained steady, controlled. "This isn't about policies. It's about respect." He turned to Linda, his expression softening. "Ma'am, you mentioned these charges weren't there before." Linda nodded, still reeling from the surreal nature of the moment. "I've had this account for over 30 years. I've never seen these charges before. They just started appearing 2 months ago." Vin's focus shifted back to Carl, one brow lifting. 2 months ago. Interesting. So tell me, why did her maintenance fees suddenly triple? Though his tone was calm, there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. Carl swallowed hard. He forced a stiff chuckle, desperate to regain control. "Mr. Diesel, I don't think you understand how banking works. Fees are adjusted based on corporate policies. If a customer doesn't meet the premium account requirements, charges are applied. That's how the system works." Vin nodded as if mulling over the explanation. "Right, but tell me, Carl, do you actually review those charges? Do you personally check if they're correct, or do you just assume the system is always right?" Carl hesitated. He could feel the trap closing in, but there was no clean escape. "The system is designed to be accurate," he answered carefully. Vin exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound that was almost amused. "So you don't check." He flipped through the documents Linda had handed him, scanning them quickly. "Here's what I see, Carl. A woman who's been a loyal customer for decades suddenly gets hit with fees she was never warned about. When she asks for answers, she's mocked and humiliated. And now, you're standing here trying to tell me it's just policy." Carl's face flushed. His fingers drummed anxiously against his forearm. We follow guidelines. We don't make exceptions." Vin's expression hardened. "That's where you're wrong. You do make exceptions, just not for people like Linda." His voice wasn't raised, yet it carried through the bank like a challenge, making Carl feel as if the walls were closing in. Brittany, the young teller, cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Mr. Jensen, maybe we should just—" Carl shot her a sharp glare, cutting her off mid-sentence. Her mouth snapped shut. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Vin stood firm, unfazed. Vin was just getting started. He turned to the watching crowd. "How many of you have had unexpected fees show up on your accounts in the last few months?" He held up Linda's papers like evidence in a trial. At first, there was silence. Then, one by one, hands began to rise, a middle-aged man in a work uniform, a young mother holding a baby, an elderly couple in the back. Soon more followed. Carl felt his stomach drop. This was no longer just about Linda. Vin nodded, scanning the room. So it's not just her. Interesting. He turned back to Carl. You might want to think very carefully about your next words. Carl swallowed hard. He was trapped. Dismissing Linda now meant dismissing half the bank's customers. Admitting fault could put his entire career at risk. But Vin didn't give him time to think. Let's check something. He gestured toward the computer. Since you're so confident the system is right, pull up her account. Let's see those fees. Carl hesitated. Vin tilted his head. What's wrong? I thought you said everything was clear for those who pay attention. Brittany's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Carl shot her a sharp look, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. She had no choice. With shaky hands, she pulled up Linda's account. The numbers appeared on the screen, glowing against the dark interface. Vin leaned in, scanning the details. A slow smile crossed his face. Well, look at that. He tapped the screen. These charges started 2 months ago, right after policy change. And not just on her account. He turned to the customers. How many of you have banked here for more than 5 years? Several hands shot up. And how many of you started seeing new charges around the same time? More hands followed. The bank fell into dead silence. Someone shifted uncomfortably near the back. Vin turned to Carl, his expression unreadable. You see where I'm going with this. Carl's face had gone pale. Mr. Diesel, I assure you, we don't target specific people. Vin held up a hand, cutting him off. You don't? That's funny because based on what I'm seeing, most of these new fees are hitting elderly customers. People less likely to challenge them. People who may not have the time or energy to fight back. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. That's not policy, Carl. That's a scam. Carl's mouth opened, then closed. His pulse pounded in his ears. Vin took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. I don't like bullies, Carl. And I really don't like people who prey on the ones who deserve the most respect. He motioned toward Linda. This woman dedicated her life to teaching, shaping young minds. And you're telling me she doesn't deserve basic decency. Carl was sweating now. There was no escape. The customers were watching. The employees were watching. And worst of all, someone was recording. A young man near the front held up his phone, capturing everything. Vin followed Carl's gaze and let out a low chuckle. Yeah, that's right. This is going out there. He turned back, his voice steady. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to reverse every single one of those charges, not just for Linda, but for every customer affected. And then you're going to apologize. Properly. Carl's jaw clenched. His career flashed before his eyes. Vin took another step forward. And if you don't, he let the sentence hang in the air before shaking his head. Well, let's just say I'd be very interested to see how corporate reacts when they find out their branch manager made headlines for defrauding elderly customers. Carl exhaled shakily. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned to Brittany. Fix it. She wasted no time. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, reversing every charge. The tension in the room shifted. Nervous whispers turned into quiet approval. Vin watched as the numbers changed on the screen. Then he turned to Linda, offering her a small nod. That's more like it. Carl's face was pure defeat. But Vin wasn't done. Now, he said, folding his arms. Let's hear that apology. Carl clenched his jaw. He swallowed hard. He hesitated, then forced the words out. Mrs. Carter, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Vin raised an eyebrow. Carl exhaled sharply. I apologize for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable. Linda didn't speak right away. She studied him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she gave a small nod. Thank you. Vin glanced around, making sure everyone had witnessed it. He let a slight smile cross his face. That wasn't so hard, was it? He turned toward the customers, scanning their faces. Let this be a lesson. Speak up. Stand up. And don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't matter. For the first time that day, the room filled with something other than tension. It filled with quiet admiration. And just like that, Vin Diesel turned, pulled his cap back on, and walked out of the bank. But the story wasn't over yet. The video would go viral. And the consequences for Carl Jensen were only just beginning. The moment Vin stepped outside, the air inside the bank shifted. Customers who had initially remained silent now exchanged murmurs of approval. Employees behind the counter, including Brittany Wallace, were still trying to process what had just happened. Carl Jensen, the once confident branch manager, stood frozen. His face had drained of color, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He had lost control of the situation, and worse, he knew it. Then his gaze snapped to the young man near the front of the line. He was still holding up his phone, still recording. Panic surged through Carl. His voice came out sharp, urgent. "Shut that down. Now." Brittany hesitated. "Sir, Carl's jaw tightened. "Now." But it was too late. The young man finally spoke, his voice loud and clear. "Already uploaded, buddy. You can't erase this." Carl's stomach plummeted. A few minutes ago, he had been in total control, dismissing Linda Carter as just another elderly woman who wouldn't fight back. Now his name and face were about to be all over the internet, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Spoke to you earlier." Linda studied her for a long moment. She had seen countless students stumble, make mistakes, and learn from them. Brittany's face was open, uncertain but sincere. "I appreciate that," Linda said finally, her voice gentle but firm. Brittany hesitated, then added, "And I'm really sorry you had to come here to fight for something that should have been yours in the first place." That, Linda knew, was the real apology. The bank's doors swung open, and for a brief moment, the entire room fell silent again. It was almost as if everyone half expected Vin Diesel to walk back in, maybe deliver one last dramatic line before disappearing into the sunset. But it wasn't Vin. It was just another customer, a woman with 2 small children, looking exhausted, her eyes flickering between the crowd and the tellers. Life, as always, continued. Linda smiled to herself. Vin Diesel didn't need to come back. He had already done what he came to do. But the story wasn't over yet. A few days later, the full impact of that afternoon hit like an earthquake. The video of the confrontation spread faster than anyone had anticipated. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded. Within 24 hours, the headquarters of First Pacific Bank had released an official statement announcing an internal review of the branch's practices. By the end of the week, Carl Jensen was removed from his position. Corporate cited a failure to uphold company values and multiple customer complaints that had suddenly gained traction thanks to the viral video. Brittany was placed under review but ultimately kept her job after admitting that she had been pressured into following unethical instructions. Most importantly, every single customer affected by the unfair fees was refunded in full. Linda watched it all unfold from the comfort of her home. She never thought a trip to the bank would turn into something this big. But as she sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reading the latest headlines about Carl's dismissal, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. And then one morning, an envelope arrived in mail. It wasn't from the bank. It was postmarked from a film studio in Los Angeles. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Mrs. Carter, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile. Vin." Tucked inside the envelope was a signed Fast and Furious poster and a personalized invitation to one of Vin Diesel's upcoming movie premieres. Linda laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. She set the note down gently, running her fingers over the signature. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt valued. She felt unstoppable. She stood up, stretched, and walked to her front door, feeling lighter than she had in years. The world wasn't perfect. But now she knew, when you fight for what's right, sometimes the right people show up to fight with you. It wasn't just the invitation or the signed poster that touched Linda. It was the acknowledgement. The simple fact that someone as famous as Vin Diesel, had seen her, had recognized her fight, and had taken the time to remind her of her own strength. She carefully placed the letter on her kitchen counter, still shaking her head in amused disbelief. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Another message from one of her former students, one of many that had been pouring in over the last few days. "Mrs. Carter, I saw the video. You always told us to stand up for ourselves, and now the whole world got to see you do it. You're a legend." Linda chuckled, her heart swelling. She had spent years teaching young minds about justice, kindness, and resilience. And now, in a way she never expected, she had become the lesson. The days passed, but the story didn't fade. News programs debated corporate accountability, customer rights, and the power of social media. Talk shows mentioned her name in passing. Even in her small town, people would stop her at the grocery store, nodding in recognition, some even thanking her. And then the day of the movie premiere arrived. Linda debated whether to go. The thought of red carpets, flashing cameras, and Hollywood glitz was far outside her quiet world of books and lesson plans. But then she thought of everything that had happened, of the way she had almost backed down that day at the bank, of how easy it would have been to accept defeat. Not anymore. She pulled on her best dress, a soft blue, one she hadn't worn in years, and tucked the invitation into her purse. The city lights dazzled as she stepped out of the car at the premiere, the buzz of reporters and fans humming around her. She barely had time to take it all in before she heard a familiar voice call out, "Mrs. Carter." She turned, and there he was, Vin Diesel, standing by the entrance, grinning as if they were old friends. He walked over, ignoring the cameras for a moment, and held out his hand. "Glad you could make it." Linda took his hand, shaking it firmly, the weight of the moment settling over her. "Wouldn't miss it," she said with a smile. As the night unfolded, cameras flashed, interviews buzzed, and the movie played on the big screen. But the real story, the one that had started in a small bank on an ordinary afternoon, had already made its impact. Because sometimes when you stand up for what's right, the world stands up with you.